New South Wales UFO research is very lucky to have Jamie and Marie and all the wonderful people here in this organization. Just love it. Love being here with all of you again for the second lecture. So this is the one that isn't the Ancient Aliens lecture, but I believe, as I said earlier, it's for the best. This is a much more relevant, germane lecture, and it's really something that's a bit more relevant to my own interests, and I think we can go a lot farther with it. So I think you will agree. I call it the cost of secrecy, from money to mind control. I'm going to start by talking about UFOs, and we're going to move into the UFO control system that I think is behind it all. Isn't it interesting when you watch a UFO special on television, for example, and they always end up with this silly question, what if they're out there? And you hear this all the time, and for anyone who's studied this subject in any detail, it's a ridiculous question even to ask. What if they're out there? What if they're out there? The whole question itself is a form of disinformation, I've decided. It's a kind of disinformation. It's a way, it's, again, like in this modern shell game that we live in. You know, a shell game, like in the streets of New York City, they used to have these guys, and they say, okay, see which 3 shells, and where's the trinket underneath, and they'll move it around. We live in a modern shell game. That question is a form of a shell game. It prompts you to look in one direction when the actual reality is in a completely different direction. It's a sleight of hand, and it's not a mistake. It's not by mistake. Years ago, in the early years of my research into the UFO subject, I think in the maybe 2000, 2001, after my first book came out, I ran into a gentleman who was the son of an Air Force, I believe Air Force major. And he told me, and this is such a typical thing, retired military people will tell their kids, years later, certain things that are important. In the case of this one guy, his dad said, son, it's real and they're here. I've never forgotten that statement. So that's the reality. It's not what if they're out there. It's real and they're here. That's what's going on. The UFO phenomenon it's a hard thing for those of us who are not familiar with it to wrap our brains around, because we're just not used to it being treated as real. We live in a world and in a culture that pretends that it's not real, in which it's never covered in the mainstream media as real. And so when you hear about it, you get this kind of psychological disconnect, and it's very difficult to integrate that reality into the reality that you're taught is real. That's the problem that we have. And so for even people who like to follow the phenomenon to some extent, you find it's very rare that someone will really fully integrate that knowledge into their worldview. That's the hardest thing to do. One thing that I'm going to submit to you as a thesis for today is this, that this phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, has entered our reality at a bad time. At a bad time. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's at a time when global financial elites are initiating their latest revolution in the world. So one of the themes that I'm going to be giving you here is that of 2 paths converging. The path of the human civilization and path that we're naturally going on, and this path that we call the UFO reality. And out of that convergence, something is being created. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, I never can assume that everyone in a room or everyone watching this video at some point is on the same page, as it were, in this subject. There are always people coming in who just don't know much about the UFO phenomenon, and they don't know what is the evidence for this even being a valid subject. It's fair. Most of the world doesn't really know a lot about this, and they don't have access to information. So let me just go over a little bit of that for those of you who want to be brought up to speed. And I promise to those of you who are familiar with this, it still won't be boring. One thing I can say definitively is that there is overwhelming evidence of concern and secrecy of UFOs by this structure here, that's the Pentagon, and by the United States Defense Establishment, and by connection, the defense establishments of all of the U.S. allies. That certainly includes Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and all the Western powers, NATO, Israel, and in fact all the non-U.S. aligned nations, Russia, China, and the rest. They are interested, and you will see in a moment just why. We have proof. We do have proof. We don't have hints. We don't have suggestions. We have proof in the form of declassified military documents coming from many nations. I'm going to show you some of the key U.S. documents. The U.S. is my #1 area of interest. I am an American citizen, but also the United States military is the predominant military in the world. They've got the most money, they've got the most reach, they have the most influence, and they have been on the spot from the beginning dealing with this phenomenon. Here's just a few statements here and there. This one's from 1947 from a 3-star general named Nathan Twining. Those of you who follow UFOs probably know this by heart. In responding to another general about these flying saucers, wrote a memo which delineated certain specific aspects of the phenomenon. This is September 1947, and one of the things he said about them is that they are circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom and domed on top. That's really specific, and ask yourself in 1947 what objects would look like that. In particular, Twining also mentioned that they were very, very fast, they were silent or nearly silent, they engage in evasive maneuvers when sighted, and so forth. And these were objects that were engaging the attention of the American military elite. So even in 1947, when the Air Force and the government said to the public, no, there's nothing to this, just go about your business, it's all hallucinations or misidentifications or hoaxes, wrong, lie. That was a lie. And the truth is revealed in these classified conversations. Here's a statement from 1949, another classified document, detailing sighting of identical object reported on January 30th, 1949 by approximately 30 people. Estimate at least 100 total sightings. Atomic Energy Commission, Air Force Special Project, something off the top of my head, I can't remember. 4th Army, local commanders perturbed by implications of phenomena. Perturbed by implications of phenomena. And it goes on. A lot of detail. Another detail from 1949, FBI document discussing how the topic known as flying discs, flying saucers, balls of fire is considered top secret by intelligence officers of the Army and Air Force. Here's a 1950 document talking about unidentified objects in the airspace over Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which to date have not been explained. Oak Ridge, like Los Alamos, like the Hanford nuclear facility in the state of Washington, all of these were major nuclear sites at the time that were experiencing unexplained objects in their airspace. All of them. Oak Ridge, quite a few. Hanford, one of the most toxic nuclear sites in the United States, was the scene of many, many overflights of UFOs. In fact, one that I don't have on here from 1950 discussed objects round in form sighted over the Hanford facility, and went on to describe how local Army, anti-aircraft battalions were engaged, local interceptors, and all other types of agencies were alerted to what was going on, and no one was able to figure it out. The investigation was ongoing at Hanford. Here's a couple more. 1950, oh yes, Canadian engineer, scientist named Wilbur Smith, who was very interested in UFOs, goes to Washington, D.C. in 1950, and through the Canadian Embassy established contact with an American scientist very much associated with the flying saucer program named Robert Sarbacher. Sarbacher was a major American defense scientist at the time. On the basis of his conversation with Sarbacher, Smith writes back to his government, the Canadian government. He says, through inquiries through the Canadian Embassy, was able to obtain this information. The matter of flying saucers is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which of course was very prominent at that time. Flying saucers exist, and so forth. Another document from 1950. This is just a very interesting military document of a violation of airspace, how the object moved in such incredible manners that it did. 1952, this is a CIA document to the director of the CIA. One of my favorite, I think this should be taught in every school in the world. The director of scientific intelligence for the CIA writes, sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. Very straightforward statement. You're talking to the director of the CIA in December 1952, and you're saying that? That's very important. I've cited this document countless times. I'll continue to cite it countless times. It's by H. Marshall Chadwell. It's a very important statement. And you don't just say such things to the director of the CIA. So basically he's saying, this isn't anything we know naturally, and it's not anything we know in terms of known aerial vehicles. And these objects are flying at great altitudes and speeds over sensitive installations. That's important. Whatever the answer is, aliens, not aliens, it's important. And it is ignored year after year around the world by all governments. And on and on. There's just a bunch of these. Here's another one at Oak Ridge, an object that flew for a tremendous speed and then stopped, and then was joined by two more objects, and then all flew off again at a radical speed to the east. Into the 1960s, this is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota in the U.S., up near the Canadian border, where an object was seen at very high altitude, comes down, tracked by NORAD, that is North American Air Defense Radar, seen visually by personnel on the ground. They get to within a certain distance. Static disrupts their radio communications. They watch it rise up and ascend, and where it is tracked on NORAD radar. That's, again, significant. And you just have to ask yourself, again and again and again, why do these sightings continually get ignored? Well, I'll be coming back to that theme with you here. And then just to wrap up some of these, there's so many more of these. 1967 incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in the state of Montana. A very well-known incident involving Lieutenant, later Captain Robert Salas, with very good documentation to support that. 10 or more nuclear missiles shut down. These were separately hardwired, by the way. They were not. They should not have gone down together. But an object at the same time was seen by above-ground personnel, a glowing red object. At the same time, below ground, these nuclear missiles went offline. They were not supposed to go offline. Boeing did an analysis of it and was not able to determine why they went offline. And in fact, one of the words that they use is no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern to this headquarters. More incidents in 1975 over nuclear sites and Air Force bases and so forth. So, you know, in the history of the Freedom of Information Act, incidentally, the best, not all, but the best documents we've gotten are from these early years. It seems to me that the spigot got shut down after the mid-1980s, to be honest with you. Certainly during the early 80s, President Reagan issued an executive order making freedom of information, A, way more expensive for citizens, and B, much more difficult to get information out, including exempting entire organizations like NORAD from FOIA requests. NORAD to this day will answer FOIA requests if they want to, if they feel like it. Otherwise, they don't have to. They're not obligated. Here's the reality that I would say. Someone is here. Something is here. And that someone or something is not any official agency that we know about in this world. Is it a secret black budget element of the U.S. or Australia or some other country? Maybe. Is it some breakaway civilization that I've hypothesized about at various times that's just gone off the grid and they've got their own incredible technology? Well, I suppose maybe. Or is it some other civilization not from here, not human? And certainly, we have to look at that as a distinct possibility. I would say likelihood, in fact. Whatever that reality is, it's being denied by our authorities. This is the key point. You know, we're like little kids with our nose pressed against the glass of a candy store trying to look inside, get inside. And whatever the reality in there is, it's something important. And we have to remember, we're not obligated to have every single answer to this phenomenon, because the fact is that, A, it's a very complex phenomenon, in my opinion, and B, there is obfuscation and denial about it. So we have to realize we're not going to have every answer. All we can do is our best, but there's a lot that we can put together. I would say the phenomenon does indicate radically advanced technology, and it's technology that has to have immense value. Let's keep that in mind. Like in terms of dollar value, in terms of civilization value. Any object that is able to completely evade the most sophisticated air defenses. You know, most recently in the New York Times in December 2017, there was two articles, of course, many of you know about this, that came out dealing with the contemporary UFO structure within the U.S. government agency, the ATIP agency, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and that's still being discussed. But one of the things, pardon me, that came out was a UFO sighting encounter that took place with the U.S. Navy in 2004. And that's actually 14 years ago, but it's recent enough that it's worth talking about. And it involved an object, the so-called tic-tac-shaped UFO, encountered by Navy Commander David Fravor, who's been on television, he's done interviews, of an object that did things that are not supposed to be possible. By Fravor's estimate, it departed, leaving visibility within 2 seconds. He had perfect visibility of 10 miles. So for an object to leave visibility in 2 seconds, it's going at about 18,000 miles per hour. So there's nothing that's supposed to go that fast. This is an object that was hovering at or under or just above the water, that when he circles down to get it, after it had been tracked, by the way, on Navy radar, he goes down to circle to get it. It goes up to meet him and then levels off and is gone. Fravor said, I don't know what that is, but I sure like to fly it. That's like a true Navy pilot speaking. There's more about that incident. Behind the scenes, there are researchers who are really digging into this one, and what clearly seems to be the case now is that that object completely penetrated the most encrypted U.S. Navy communications. And we believe this because it was at the rendezvous point before the Navy pilots arrived there. They were told to arrive at a certain point. The object wasn't there when the command was given. And by the time they arrived, the object was there waiting for them, as it were. Now, to be able to do that means these highly encrypted Navy communications are a matter of no problem at all for it. That's really significant. That's really important and valuable, of great value. These things, whatever they are, they're not us. They're not us. They represent also, let's not forget this, an advanced infrastructure. In other words, whatever's behind them has some kind of society. Maybe it's pure artificially intelligent algorithms, for all we know. But there's some kind of pattern of thinking, some structure of organization that is represented behind these things. And all of it's kept secret from us. It's all kept secret, except in the form of, ridiculous questions like, what if they're out there? So that's it. Crash retrievals is another part of the reality. That's a much younger me, 2004 version of me with astronaut Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14. So when I met him for the first time in person. Edgar Mitchell was actually very helpful to me in my early career. He endorsed all of my early books. I was always grateful for that. The important thing about Edgar Mitchell was that for about 10 years, from the late 90s to about 2006, 2007 or so, he spoke multiple times publicly about his knowledge of ultra-elite connections in the government who told him explicitly of programs, deeply secret programs, to study alien technology and alien bodies. Now, the man was a moon-walking astronaut. Whatever you think about the NASA missions, even if you don't believe they went, he was, who would not want to be Edgar Mitchell's buddy? He has incredible prestige. And by the way, he was a PhD and an extremely good man and an extremely intelligent man. And he was making these statements. And no one in the media was touching it, not touching it with a 10-foot pole. So what was that all about, you wonder? Incidentally, I spoke to another scientist around the same time who had nearly as much stature as Dr. Mitchell, a very well-connected scientist with a lot of experience in the defense industry and the intelligence community, who said to me explicitly nearly the exact same thing that Edgar Mitchell said to me and to the world, which was that, to this scientist's knowledge, at deep, deep, deep classified levels, there were scientists who had in their possession alien technology, and then he practically whispered to me, and at least one body that he personally knew about. And that's a scientist who could be outed, and I won't and can't out him at this time. But he's a well-known man, and I believe him and I respect him. I was also told in another occasion by a person with access, in my opinion, who talked about how expensive the program is to replicate this technology. Of course it would be expensive. And he just let out that the security to maintain secrecy was actually 7 to 8 times more expensive than the scientific research and development, which caught me a little bit by surprise. But he was quite explicit. Unfortunately, I wasn't smart enough to ask a good follow-up question about that, but I think I still can. So, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Science is expensive, but security is really expensive, not just guys with M16 guns, but underground facilities, bribery money, who knows what else. You know, money to ensure collaboration of media, politicians. I think it could be quite expensive indeed. A little bit about crash retrievals, just for those of you who need a little bit more persuasion, I suppose. This man was named Leonard Stringfield, and I never had the pleasure to meet him. In the late 70s, he published this book called Situation Red, the UFO Siege. And, you know, in the late 70s, it's easy for us to forget now, but back then, UFO researchers, at least, were not taking the idea of crash retrievals seriously at all. They were not taking seriously the idea of contact with these other beings. They were not taking seriously the idea that someone could have more than one sighting. There was a lot that they just thought was too far out there to take seriously. But Stringfield collected crash retrieval stories and published some of them in this book, and at that time, then received huge numbers of people who came up to him. Of course, that's how it happens. When someone realizes they're allowed to talk about it, and when they realize, oh, that's the guy to talk to, they flock to him. And Stringfield collected dozens, scores of very interesting reports. I just have a list of a few, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but they're interesting. They're just symptomatic. You know, some of these would come from widows of military personnel who would recount the stories that their husband gave them years before. Some were from still living individuals who had the direct experiences. Some were about seeing alien bodies. Some were about seeing discs at Wright-Patterson, or, you know, all different variations on a theme. You've all heard of the alien autopsy movie from the late 90s. That was the Ray Santilli thing. Well, for what it's worth, videos of dead aliens, those stories had been circulating for a long time before that. And one Stringfield collected was from 1953. A radar specialist at a base in New Jersey was shown film. He said, one day, in 1953, I was taken to a military theater, and I sat down with a few other individuals, and we were shown a film, a movie, of a crashed UFO and dead aliens inside a tent. The interior of the craft and everything. He said, it was amazing. It was in a desert. No one gave us any explanation for this film. Then the lights went on, and we were all escorted out of the theater. There was no debriefing. He said, I've always wondered what that was. And then 2 weeks later, after the event, an officer on the base came up to me and said, that film you were shown 2 weeks ago, forget it, it was a hoax. And he's thinking, what was that all about? The only thing that I could suggest to you as to what it might have been about was perhaps a test, which this radar specialist might have failed. In other words, if you're running a UFO program, that's very sensitive. Maybe you're doing a little recruiting at that base. Who might be a good person to have in the program? So you have to find out, how do these people respond to such an extreme reality as this, right? Maybe this guy didn't respond in a perfectly good way. Maybe he talked to someone. Maybe he had a reaction that they deemed not quite perfect. Or maybe they just didn't need him. In any case, that's not an unusual story. Stringfield collected a few of those types of stories. But then there are other more explicit ones. A widow of her husband, she said he had told her once of having guarded 9 dead alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's U.S. Air Force headquarters. In 1966, 4 feet tall, told there were 30 bodies at the base in total, told there was a craft at the base, and much more. A lot of these. And, you know, none of them by themselves would constitute proof of of crash UFOs. Of course, I'll grant you that. But you have to wonder, when there are so many that corroborate each other, I think we would be very foolish to just dismiss them. And in fact, the Stringfield stories are just the beginning of this evidence that we have recovered technology that's very far advanced. This gentleman, he's still around, James Goodall. I met him once briefly at one of the UFO conferences. He's not really a UFO researcher. He's an aviation researcher, and in the 80s particularly was writing for Jane's Defense, major defense publication, Aviation Week, Space Technology, Interavia. These are high-level, sophisticated aviation publications, and he wrote for them. He also spent a lot of time cultivating people in Nevada, near Area 51 at the Groom Lake facility. A lot of secrecy going on there, particularly in the 1980s before a lot of this information came out. Goodall said there's a lot of unconventional technologies there. He had one contact with 12 years at Groom Lake. He asked him, do you believe in UFOs? The guy said, absolutely, positively, they exist. He said, would you expand on this? The guy said, no. The guy did later, he said, we have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious. It's a famous statement among researchers, but I think everyone should know these things. George Lucas, better than Star Wars, better than Star Trek, he said, better than anything you see in the movies. That was another source from the mid-80s, 1985. Goodall says, would you expand on that? He says, no. So Goodall believed that there were a number of black programs, that is secret programs, flying out of Groom Lake, not counting the B-2 stealth bomber, which was at the time, including a silent flying triangle. And we're going way back now, 25 years or more, that he made this conclusion. And then you have this story, the alien reproduction vehicle. It's again, to researchers, it's pretty well known. The story goes back to November 1988, just after George Bush Sr. won the presidential election against Michael Dukakis to follow Ronald Reagan as president in the U.S. Bush was not yet inaugurated as president, but he was president-elect. And during that period, there was an air show that this man, Mark McCandlish, in California, was invited to go to. McCandlish was and is an aviation writer and an illustrator. He's a first-class aviation illustrator. And he was going to go to this air show with his friend Brad Sorensen, who was an aerospace executive. They were friends. At the last minute, McCandlish had to back out. He had a deadline. So Sorensen took a friend of his family who was a super top-level U.S. defense official. We don't know the name. We don't have it confirmed. The official says at the air show, let's go to the real air show. It takes him to Lockheed's Hellendale facility, a place called the Big Hangar, heavily guarded, guys with guns. The official says, don't say a word, I'll get you in. They get in, and it's an enormous facility with a curtain dividing it. On one side are losing bids to major defense contracts, very interesting aircraft. On the other side, as Sorensen later said to a number of people who interviewed him, were 3 hovering flying saucers. Small, medium, and large. They were nicknamed Baby Bear, Mama Bear, and Papa Bear. And they looked like this. One of them was open, so Sorensen could look inside. He gave the description to McCandlish, who drew this. There was a 4-star general giving a lecture at a podium about them. By the way, Sorensen said they were hovering. He said, I looked for cables and suspension. He says, there was nothing. They were just hovering. His senses were super heightened, he said. He was very alert, noticed everything, he said. Anyway, the 4-star general was lecturing. He says these were the alien reproduction vehicles. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory, I think. And said that they'd gone all throughout the solar system by then, by 1988, and that they utilized the vacuum as their source of energy. This was 1 year before the first published paper on zero-point energy came out by Dr. Harold Puthoff, which describes zero-point energy sometimes as a vacuum. So was this a zero-point energy source of power? It's a reasonable question. I guess probably. George Knapp is a journalist. He's still around out in Las Vegas. He's the one who made Bob Lazar famous, Bob Lazar, who claimed to have gone just south of Area 51 and saw a flying saucer that had to be studied and replicated. Knapp actually has developed more than 25 Area 51 insiders. I say more than a dozen, but it's actually more than that. All of whom have corroborated one part or another of Lazar's story. In other words, that there is a program to study and replicate advanced alien tech, for lack of a better word. All of these people had come to Knapp privately. Most were going to go public, and none of them did because they were all afraid of talking publicly. A few said that they were threatened, and so forth. So that's that. And then you have this, the Nellis UFO. This was a video leaked to the television show Hard Copy back in 1994. It was taken not long before that due to the analysis that was done. Taken inside Nellis Testing Range. That's in Nevada. Nellis Testing Range is very large. And you can watch this on YouTube, and you hear the personnel watching it saying things like, what is that? Is that a helicopter? There's data on the top of this video here that indicates the azimuth and the altitude of the object, and by the data there you can calculate the speed of the object and the size too to some extent. So a few analyses have been done on this. Estimate that it's about 15 feet wide, 9, 10 feet high. It, within a very brief period of time, had a range and speed from 15 miles per hour to about 500 miles per hour. So it was very, very extraordinary. And did a right angle turn at about 140 miles per hour. Had other odd things about it. It appears almost to change shape. Maybe that's just an illusion of the angle that it's at. Who knows what this is, but it seems flexible. So that's the question to ask is, who's building it? Is that us or is that not us? I think I would guess that this is something that the United States black budget world has been working on. That's almost 25 years ago to be able to do something like that. It's quite advanced. Gary McKinnon, a man that I'm in touch with to this day, a man who back in the late 90s was obsessed, I think it's fair to say, with UFOs, like all of us, many of us can do, and was online at the time looking for evidence of the UFO cover-up. He's a UK citizen, but was at the U.S. Space Command website in 2000 when he got information that he said indicated a secret space program named Solar Warden, in which he found a list of officers' names under the heading non-terrestrial officers. He found a list of fleet-to-fleet transfers and a list of ship names that were not in any U.S. naval inventory. So what were these ships? This is before you could do screenshots. This is a much earlier period of the internet and of our technology. He was arrested in 2002, and for years, the extradition of Gary McKinnon was highly sought after by the U.S. government. It became a real cause celeb in Britain. I'm sure many of you followed this at the time. Gary McKinnon ultimately was not extradited, thankfully, to the U.S. There's a lot of talk and concern that he would actually go to Guantanamo Bay. It's an interesting thing to say. You know, over the years, the coverage of McKinnon's case really mutated. In the early years, there was a lot of emphasis on the UFO connection. After all, he was looking for UFOs. He claimed to find evidence of a secret space program. But as the years went by, when the case was covered in the media, what you'll find, and go look this up, the UFO connection just became sidelined. He was now just a defense hacker. And the important connection was basically just glossed over. But the fact is that Gary McKinnon did gain what he felt was sensitive information related to the UFO subject, was arrested, and the attempt to extradite him was real for a decade. So there's that. Oh yeah, this little quote by Ronald Reagan from the 1980s, just a little thing to keep in mind. Reagan kept a diary. And in 1985, he writes, had lunch with 5 top space scientists. It was fascinating. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people. Well, the United States has never orbited 300 people at any given time, not even close. So that's a very interesting capacity. All of these are indicative of a clandestine presence in space. And that doesn't have to indicate that it's in response to the UFO phenomenon. I will certainly grant you that. The United States takes it as a given that it must dominate space as a platform of operations. You know, you can't dominate every country on the globe with precision bombs and stealth fighters and so forth if you don't control the space above the atmosphere with satellites that give you all that data. So space is very important for the United States to dominate. And it's totally conceivable that there would be a major militarized presence in space that would be very classified. So this statement by itself doesn't prove in any way that they're there because of UFOs. What I will add, and it's not on any of these slides, I'll just tell you here, is that during the 1980s there was a number of very good pieces of evidence to show that NORAD was tracking objects coming in from deep space to Earth orbit. There's the case of Simone Mendez, a U.S. Air Force, I think she was a non-commissioned officer, or no, she was like an ensign, that's right, who in early 1980s, I spoke with Simone years ago about this, got her military papers as well, and her case is pretty well known by researchers. She illegally gained access to NORAD information about deep space objects. She was not allowed to see this. Some other person in the Air Force showed her. And it was not authorized. She got into a great deal of trouble about this, and it really made her life difficult for many years. But her story is out there in the open. There's a lot of documentation proving that this is legitimate. There is also, I have a friend who's retired from the aerospace field, a man named Ron Reguer, who worked for a company called Aerojet in the 80s, gained access to a database nicknamed the Itty Bitty Database, and it essentially is a database detailing the activities of a satellite known as a DSP satellite, Defense Satellite Program, a series of geosynchronous satellites in Earth orbit, ostensibly to monitor launches of missiles. What Ron has argued is that the DSP was ideally designed to monitor something else as well, and that is UFOs. The DSP satellites from the early 70s through 1991 tracked almost 300 events of fast walkers in Earth orbit, that is space-based UFOs, including famous event over Iran in 1976, in September of that year, and including an event of an object coming from deep space in 1984, I believe, object coming in from deep space, hovering like a kilometer or two away from one of the satellites, and then moving off. So there's things going on in Earth orbit that are not explainable. By the way, Ron came across that list accidentally but legally and then published it. I have a copy of it. I think there's more evidence that there's a program to reproduce UFO-type technology, and some of it may just be dovetailing with what we call UFOs now. I have a research associate, a lady in central Arkansas, spoke with her a few years ago, who she's got third-generation night vision binoculars, which are pretty neat, and likes to look at the skies. And she writes to me. She says there are all kinds of craft up there: military research and development drones, drone triangles, and even a huge rectangular craft. She writes, I have seen these craft cloak. I saw one cloak over my house at treetop level, and I tell you, it could not be seen at all, and I was only about 50 yards away. I've also seen these drones, she calls them drones, from less than 30 feet, and there is no movement, vibration, nothing. They look as though they are glued to the sky. She's one of the best experts you'll ever meet, by the way, in military drone technology. She's done FOIA requests now and got hundreds and hundreds of documents in her house where she's gone through. She seems to know it very well. Her belief, incidentally, is that most UFO sightings we see are actually not extraterrestrials. They're just secret drones, next generation, highly advanced. She does believe in extraterrestrial UFOs and thinks that some of them are, but her opinion is that there's a tremendous classified infrastructure out there that is explaining a lot of these sightings. So what does it look like to me? It's always important to distinguish what we know and what we think we know. What we know and what things look like. Both are valid. In fact, both are necessary. Like, we need to know what we know, and we need to be unafraid to speculate as to what things look like based on what we know. So Let's do that. So I think there's a major effort going on to conceal the UFO reality. I think that's obvious. To replicate UFO technology. And I would just say to go off-world in some capacity. The leaks indicate that. I think that actually is what has been going on. I've been saying this for many years now. Key point I want to make, all of this stuff ain't free. It costs a lot of money. Where's that money coming from? It can't openly come from tax dollars, right? It's not going to be a line item in any government budget. Secret space program. It's not going to do that. Black triangles, that's obviously not in there. So where does it come from? Well, it requires what we call a black budget. That is secret spending. It's black. We call it black because you can't see it. It's secret spending. It's off the record. It's an end run around the system. And in the story of the United States, I guess the one I know best, it requires a fundamental corruption of that system. You know, all of the Western governments are based on the idea that they have elected representatives and they requisition tax dollars from you, and you pay them a certain amount of money, and that money is supposed to be accountable for. But what if some of it isn't accountable? Well, officially speaking, that's the case in the U.S. U.S. officially, in all the ridiculously deceptive mainstream articles, even they now talk about a black budget. Like Wired magazine a bunch of years ago estimated that the U.S. black budget was $50 billion. Now that's more money than the defense budgets of most nations, and that's simply the secret element of the U.S. black budget, and I would guarantee you that that is low as an estimate. I just spent a week with one of my favorite researcher colleagues, Catherine Austin Fitts. Some of you know who she was. She was a high-level government official in the George Bush Sr. administration, and like all good government officials, has gone rogue. In her case, she would be the first to say, it's not like she chose that path. She was forced into it. She was hunted down. She was like a real-life version of Enemy of the State, you know, like that movie, but for real. And just started going public with what she knew about the deep, deep, unbelievable levels of corruption, financial corruption of the U.S. federal government and beyond. She's, without a doubt, I think the world's leading public expert in what we might call black budget economics. I'm honored to be your friend, to be honest with you, and to be able to chat with her about things. But what she would argue, and what she has argued, is that what we call a black budget is a lot more than, you know, classified tax dollars at work. They are financial fraud, securities fraud, narcotics trafficking, money, all of these unvouchered funds that go into privatized hands to run programs that, you know, you don't have to explain them to the public because you have all this money. It's a nice, huge, enormous slush fund, which actually, to go further, she has argued, are probably existing now in the form of a classified endowment, as it were. In other words, a stash of money that is generating its own interest revenue to fund a massively expensive infrastructure. I'm going to come back a little later to her latest, she's in the news lately, over research that she has done in conjunction with a professor named Mark Skidmore of Michigan State University in the U.S. And they, along with his graduate students, are now detailing more missing money from the U.S. system. And at last tally, they've come up to, brace yourself, a total of $21 trillion over the last 20 years. Not million, not billion, but trillion. So that's 1,000 billion. And if you think that's impossible, just listen to Catherine describe this sometime. There's actually a very good and humorous, but very good description on RT, God forbid, RT, run, on RT by the commentator Lee Camp. It's recent, and he talks about this $21 trillion. It's very funny, but he's very on point. It's about 10 minutes long. You can find it. He's very good. He talks about Catherine. He mentions Skidmore and this missing money. Catherine and Skidmore are continuing their work in, and they actually believe that they're not even done. It's more than 21 trillion. That's all they've gotten to right now. There are elements of the U.S. federal government that they haven't even begun to look at yet. But this all goes from 1998 to 2015. I believe 2015. So close to 20 years. A lot of money. If you remember, just before 9/11, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, this is when the Bush team were brand new at that time, so it was no skin off their nose to state that there was $2.6 trillion, that they amended to $2.3 trillion of undocumented, unaccountable transfers. Who knows where the heck they went? And then came 9/11, and that question was swept aside. Just officially speaking, the U.S. government says that they have the answer to this. They said, no, the money isn't gone. It's not stolen. We just have hundreds of accounting systems, and no one knows how to talk to each other. And, you know, it's just like we're unable to balance our checkbook, so that's what it is. And we're figuring it out. And they gave this matter to a fellow by the name of Dov Zakheim, who has his own corrupt background, in my opinion. He was in charge of getting that number down to 0. Like, if you want to believe that, be my guest. They've resolved the whole discrepancy, so wonderful. Thank you. Generating the money, I'm not an accountant. Some of you probably are better at this than I am. How do you get it all? Well, that's a question for creative accountants. There's people a lot smarter than I'll ever be who work these problems out to generate the money and to go around the system, but they do it. So now this is a nice little graphic. You see how sophisticated my graphic is. I'm really good at Photoshop. But it's a good visual. I think it's useful. So I think I've been talking about this UFO reality just now. You know, the fact that there's this other reality that's inserted itself into our world. Maybe they've been here all along. They probably have, but we've become aware of it in an explicit way for a certain period of time, and it's affected our civilization. But there's also this trajectory that we've been on for a little while, and they're intersecting, and that's taking us where we're going. You'll see what I mean in a moment. What I'll just say for the moment is the UFO reality has, it's very interesting. I don't just deal with UFO researchers, so I'll talk to researchers of 9/11 research, or false flag research, or just geopolitics in general. I've done different interviews and appearances at places that are not UFO related. And so that's another part of the alternative research community. And you find in that field that there's this schism where some will just go running in terror from anything related to UFOs, and they think it's ridiculous and pseudoscience. And others are very quietly, sometimes not so quietly, interested in it, and they'll come and talk to me about it. But to those people who think it's not a legitimate subject, I just want to bring to their attention. Like, you're willing to distrust your government on everything else, from 9/11 to chemtrails to underground bases to regime change or whatever it is, but not on this. Not on UFOs. And you cannot recognize the propaganda effort that has been put into this to draw you away from the UFO subject. So those researchers are being played every bit as effectively as the general public. All right? They're allowing themselves to be played like a violin by the masters. And those masters are at the very top of our intelligence and media hierarchy. They know exactly what they're doing. And a lot of these researchers are being manipulated. So what I would say is that the UFO subject is a key instigator of our black budget civilization, our black budget world. Not the only, but very important indeed, going right back to the 1940s. When you have to replicate expensive technology and keep it off the grid, as it were, then that's a key instigator of the black budget, isn't it? UFO reality is also involved in covert attempt to weaponize the technologies. And that's not a hint or suggestion either. That can be proven in at least one document that's official, which is the so-called Condign report out of the UK from the late 1990s. It's 400 pages. A lot of it's kind of dry, but there's a very, very interesting segment in there. My friend John Burroughs, former U.S. Air Force, is the one who did the real legwork to find this. Anyway, they talked in the UK intelligence community about, they took the UAP phenomenon or UFO phenomenon as real for granted. There's no question about that. And the real interest is to weaponize the technologies there. Of course, they're military people. That's how they think. So basically with the UFOs, you create the black budget world. You want to weaponize the technology. You want to hide your breakthroughs. You create what I have called a breakaway civilization. That is a classified world that gets these key breakthroughs and then runs away with it. If they classify the breakthroughs, that makes it by definition illegal for you to have those breakthroughs. So if you have those breakthroughs, if you're in the US, good luck for you. You're not going to get anywhere with it. And now with globalization, things like TPP, which has been ratified by all those countries except the US, one of the points of these is to institutionalize intellectual property rights globally. So the idea would be that in the future, some genius in some other country, if they come up with a free energy device that just happens to be patented and classified in the US black budget world, good luck getting it out. You won't get it out. So what we're seeing is a world of classifying technological breakthroughs and hiding them from the rest of the world. And I think it does create a civilization that's broken away from ours. They have better science, better technology, different cosmology, most likely. So yes, I think that counts as a different civilization, including a secret space program. That, I believe, is our reality. As out there as it seems, to those of you who may be new to this, yes, that's what I believe is the case. So there's a big secret infrastructure in our world, and it's off limits to pretty much everyone. When I was in Berlin during the period that the wall came down in 1989, I spent a few months there, and my German once was a little bit better than it is now. There was a German newspaper that I had a political cartoon. Because at that time, not only was Berlin opening up, but the entire Eastern European communist empire was crumbling, right? You remember this. And one of those nations was Romania under Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, a bad place to live under them for sure. Romania was one of the last places to have their revolution. And there was a cartoon, I'd love to find it, I remember seeing it, of all these people partying and having a good time, and then in the middle of that was a man sitting in a chair, tied to the chair, blindfolded. And he had a banner that said Romania. So that was Romania. That's us in a very real sense today. There's this infrastructure going on all around us beyond our knowledge and beyond our permission to see. It's there. And again, it's expensive. This is a graph I put together a little while ago that I kind of like. I think it describes visually an important part of our world, the realities that we live within. So you see in this circle, it's brightest in the middle, and that's where all the attention is always given. I call that mass reality. That's CNN, Kim Kardashian, Monday Night Football reality. It's like, look over here, look at this, focus on this meaningless information. Now, when you go to university for the first time, this happened to me, you start reading academic books and I think, oh, I'm very educated now. I realize that mass media is simply trivial nonsense for uneducated souls. How educated I am. I now listen to National Public Radio and read Noam Chomsky, and I'm way out there. I've figured it all out. That's academic reality. And that's basic. And that's, yeah, they're a little pretentious, let's face it. If you teach at a university, you know that's true. They've got it all figured out. Well, they have more figured out, it's true, than you're going to if you're just watching Dancing with the Stars, but they don't have it all figured out. And the reason is that the academic world itself is not privy to the classified world. It just isn't by its very nature. Classified reality is off limits. Historians, which is the field I know best, they if you press them, like they'll admit, yes, we don't have access to classified information until we get it declassified. But then they criticize like they forget. And it's almost as if like they go through their lives as if all that classified stuff doesn't exist. But the fact is it does exist, and they don't get to it. That's the classified world. When I was, years ago, back in the late Jurassic era, when I was a graduate student, otherwise known as the 1980s and 90s, I tried getting books on the CIA in my University of Rochester library. The University of Rochester is a great school. Very few books on the CIA back then. It's probably more now. Not much. A large handful, maybe. And there's a reason for that, because if you're doing your job well, of course you're not going to have information come out. So that's just how it is. But even within the classified world, there's only a small segment of it that really has access to this subject that we have been talking about. I call that the breakaway reality. And you see it's getting darker because it's harder to see. It's harder to make out. And then those people in that society, they still can't see what these other beings, whatever these other beings are, the ETs, I call them the others sometimes. That's the darkest of all. And it's hard to know exactly what is going on. And so we're looking through different layers of reality. And for all I know, there may be additional layers involved here that I'm not even aware of. So let me shift gears now to what I call our all-too-human hierarchy. That's J.P. Morgan. And, you know, something occurred to me not long ago that I do think of as historically significant. And it's that for about 200 years in our civilization, let's say from the Industrial Revolution, from around 1750, you know, when Britain really got going on this, till the late 20th century, roughly, let's just say, our human civilization was really lucky because we had unleashed, to a large extent, the value of free enterprise capitalism. And what that did was it unleashed the creative capability of millions and millions of really smart, ambitious, energetic people who had really good ideas and wanted to make some money. And what they ended up doing was create a lot of products based on scientific breakthroughs that transformed our world like almost overnight with cars and TVs and Morse code and everything else, right? It remade our world so profoundly. We just take this for granted. We forget. But it also involved the creation of a middle class for the only time in human history, really. A unique creation. And so I would hazard to guess that most of us have labored under the assumption that this was a natural development, this Industrial Revolution. And I start to wonder that maybe it wasn't such a natural development. And I wonder if it happened only because those hierarchies at the top of our food chain allowed it to happen. As I write here, power elite have always wanted to live like gods. Always. Never any different. But from ancient pharaohs through the Middle Ages to today. That's what they want. They want to live like gods. And during the period of the Industrial Revolution, it became evident that by allowing people enough freedom to pursue their economic reality as they see fit, that's what free enterprise means, after all, right? It's true economic freedom for you to pursue your dreams in the way that you see fit, that actually created tremendous wealth and opportunity, even for those upper elite, and made their lives better too. They needed an infrastructure of, to a large extent anyway, free human beings. And it made their society stronger, and it made them stronger, so they allowed it to happen. It was an amazing thing in our civilization. But I might submit to you the possibility that we're not needed in quite the same way to them anymore. And that some of them, looking down from their ivory castles or whatever they live in, look down at us and think, maybe not so much anymore. And here's why I will suggest to you. First of all, computer hardware and what is known as Moore's Law. I'm not going to bore you to death with that. It's basically the doubling of computing capability every, 18 months, 24 months, whatever it is. It's true. It's held true since the 1960s. Computing capability is off the charts from what it used to be. And it's not just processing power. It's kind of the whole thing. The sum total of computing capability is just off the charts. We all know this. We've all seen it. Then there's artificial intelligence, which I always laugh. People think UFOs are out there. Read some good books on the future of AI, and then come back to me and tell me how weird UFOs are. These people in the AI field, some of them are like Dr. Frankenstein, to be honest with you. They scare me. They have these beliefs that I just think, you want people to be immortal? You actually do. Well, they do, some of them. But they also believe in your laptop computer in another generation having a godlike level of intelligence. That's Ray Kurzweil's statement. And others say the similar thing, that maybe your computer won't be truly conscious the way you are. Of course it won't be. It's not a human being. But it'll have some semblance of that where it will seem conscious enough that you'll believe it's conscious, except it'll have an IQ of 500 or more or whatever. Godlike intelligence. So that's, I don't know if that'll actually happen in full-blown capacity or in a partial capacity, but it's happening. We all know it's happening. And then there's quantum computing and molecular computing, which some young genius on an airplane once told me about. That was a new thing. There's nanotech, robotics, 3D printing and scanning, next generation 3D printing. Think about how some of these technologies will work together. DNA mapping, gene editing, CRISPR technology, for instance, brain mapping. All of these are real. And then it continues. Implants for greater abilities. This is no longer just science fiction. This stuff is happening. Population profiling, like Minority Report, where they, right now this is already true. Google will profile you. These advertising companies and corporations can profile you in such a way that they can know more about you than you know about yourself in certain key ways. Like, they can predict your behavior based on web searches alone, based on email messages, and you know the information's out there, and you don't have access to it too, which is rather galling, right? Then facial and voice recognition. You can't hide from the system anymore. They'll find you. There's no escape anymore. Never. It's gone. Comprehensive surveillance, whether insect drones or who knows what next generation surveillance capabilities are going to be. Your guess is as good as mine. Mind reading technologies, that's real. You read about these every so often, you know, watered down mainstream versions of the reports. That the last time I checked, it was like if they attach your brain to wires, they can actually translate your brain activities to a rough extent, you know, not exact. Well, that's with wires, that's now. How long do you think it'll take before they do it without wires and with greater precision once they map the brain and really know all the spots, what they mean? There's actually, I read an article a year or two ago, not long ago, that professed that scientists are able to translate certain brain patterns into words, right? How accurately? I don't know. Probably not 100%, but this is where we're moving. So with all of that, and then ultimately, ultra-fast, ultra-intelligent machines, robots, virtual entities. This is why we, people, to some extent, are really not quite necessary anymore. They don't need us. They don't need human societies organized around free labor, free enterprise, ingenuity, human creativity. There's something called the robo-apocalypse. It's not the Terminator coming to kill you. It's just the Terminator coming to take your job away. That's real. Now, you know, people will say, well, yeah, we've been worried about this forever, and there's always new jobs coming online. True. True. It's not like there are no new jobs in these fields. But do they really replace all the old jobs? In the U.S., I think the largest single profession is that of truck driver or driver. What's going to happen to these guys and women when Google Drive takes their jobs? You know, seriously, they're not all college educated. Most of them aren't. What are they going to do? What are you going to do with a whole population of people where there's nothing for them? All right? So there's a large, increasingly growing population that really will be truly, literally expendable. What's the goal for the people at the top? The same that it's always been. Genetic superiority, which they're going to get through CRISPR, because they can afford it, you know, and their kids and their grandchildren will be smarter, stronger, faster, like the bionic man, more immune to diseases than the kids of other less wealthy people, undoubtedly. Unbounded luxury, of course, they all want that. And especially immortality. You know they want it. They're going to get it, or at least to some extent. And I'm sure they're going to live a completely freakish life, because the fact is you're not supposed to be immortal. That's a quick way to go insane. They're going to go insane. They think this is a good thing. It's not a good thing. But the fact is they're trying to move toward it. They think it's wonderful because no one wants to die. And they're going to go for it. We'll see what kind of twisted version of future humanity results from that. I developed this little chart some time ago I always think about, like, who owns what in this world. It's hard to know who owns what. Try to find out sometime. Go look at, like, who owns the major stock of all the major corporations in the world and all the intertwining directorates. And I talked with Catherine Fitz about this just the other day. It's basically, I think, impossible to get a list of the truly top wealth, like, owners in this world. I mean, Forbes magazine, sorry, but I'm not taking that. You know, the real wealth, I think, is hidden. But however you look at it, you've got the tiniest percentage of people. What was the last update on this? I think the top 8 people, the top 6 people in the world, had as much wealth as the bottom 50% of humanity. I think it's the top 8 people. The number keeps going down. The top 1% of wealth owners worldwide own roughly 50% of all wealth. And so it goes. So basically what you have are 4 classes of human beings on this planet. Owners, managers, worker bees, and expendables. Where's the line? Here's the line for the expendables. It's somewhere in there. I unfortunately erased it. I didn't mean to. But you get the idea. And that number, and the expendables, it's not that I think people are expendable. I don't. But in terms of today's civilization, there are a growing number, I think, who are entering this world, entering the workforce without any real skills whatsoever. Barely able to read, do math. What are they going to do? So there's a world that's just passing them by. And that's not a good thing. Not a good thing. So the goals then, I don't want to keep restating this. A new system of royalty and ownership on this planet is shaping up right now before our eyes. A breakaway financial structure, breakaway legal structure. Law is something that applies to us. It doesn't really apply to those people at the very top of our food chain. End of nations is important. So what's happening is the creation of a new paradigm in which nations no longer are really relevant. And it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes time, but it's happening. Greater financial control over the people. You know, maybe you and I can't break into the Bilderberg meetings that are held every year, but you can go to the Aspen Institute in Colorado, which is, I kind of describe as a Bilderberger meeting for the people. Like, you can just go there, and a lot of the same people who go to the Bilderberg meetings speak at the Aspen Institute. They have conversations about how they think the world should be. And they're much more politically correct and diplomatic in what they say now than they would have in J.P. Morgan's day. That's true. But it's basically the same. It's all about financial control and micromanagement of national economies and the elimination, really, of true freedom for people to pursue their own path. That's really what's happening. It's a new feudalism. That's really what they're... And involving not just financial control, but total mind control over the people. And this is where I'm going now for the rest of this lecture. So let me go into it. I'm going to skip this slide. I don't really need this right now. So let's talk about methods of control. How are we being controlled? Well, the answer is we are being controlled in a number of ways, one of which is financial. We are controlled financially in a variety of ways, removing and controlling economic opportunities via offshoring jobs. We've all heard about that. Via automation. These are probably the 2 big ones. I live in upstate New York in the city called Rochester. That was once where Eastman Kodak dominated. Before my very eyes, I watched Kodak go poof. Watched it happen. I spoke to hundreds, literally hundreds of Kodak employees all through the system. I knew some of them quite well. And I just watched as Kodak went first to Mexico and then to China. And then, of course, came digital photography, caught them completely off guard, and they just were gone. They just were gone. But what happened in Kodak's case has been repeated throughout so much of my country, and I'm sure in many of the industrial countries, overnight. And, you know, these people that I would meet, they're in their 50s and 60s, sometimes younger, totally unprepared for finding themselves in a new position in life, and almost never, a few of them finding better jobs, but most of them not finding better jobs. So that's one problem. And then automation, as I talked about the robo-apocalypse. But then, again, I live in the state of New York, which is unbelievably bureaucratized and heavily taxed. I don't understand how anyone can start a business in my state. It's so difficult. And I think this is true probably in most countries, probably true in Australia. Lots of regulations to the extent that it makes it so difficult and expensive to unleash, it's the word I guess I like to use right now, freedom and creativity. So it makes it very difficult, financial control right there. And then everything in the name of safety and security. More and more regulations, and I'm not trying to sound like I don't believe in safety and security and regulations. I mean, we need laws. But I think it's undeniable over the last 20 plus years, we've seen an unbelievably bureaucratized, micromanaged, regulated society to the extent that favors large corporations because they're the ones that have got the legal teams. They've got the ability to deal with the bureaucracies. They've got the ability legally to deal with all the regulations. They're able to get their accountants to line all their paperwork up in a row nice and neatly. Little guys and little gals can't do that so easily at all. Oh yeah, I write down calls for universal basic income. This is another of these ideas that a lot of the AI people, they're calling for this because they know that the robots are going to take your job. So what do they say? Well, everyone needs their own income. I'm like, that's great. That tells me, A, you know nothing about economics, like that you're going to make that work. But B, that's the perfect way to make everyone totally dependent on the state for your very existence. Good luck with that. But this is the type of financial control that we're moving toward. When you get everything from a state authority, you have no leverage. You have none. Another method of control is surveillance. Oh yeah, well we know all this. Tracking your ISP, tracking your browser, tracking your email with government agencies. This is probably universal now. No matter how free or unfree a country is supposed to be. It goes on everywhere. Social media, Facebook, monitoring, tracking, not just government, but your future employer. They all know what you do now. And you have an entire generation now of young people, something like 25% of the population are post 9/11, I think, something like that. These are people who grew up without any understanding of the before times, like in my country. They don't even know what that was like, what privacy was supposed to be like. It's gone. It's all gone. It's all gone away, and it's not coming back. I don't see how it would come back. So all the monitoring, it's just 24/7, and it's created a new personality, which I'm going to come to in just a moment. But all the new tech that comes online, the new apps on your phone, to connect you even more and more and more to the society around you so that you can never escape, ever. Monitor your location, your body, your health, sometimes your state of mind, your finances. All of these, there's all these different apps. Do you actually think that none of that is accessible to other groups that are going to get access to it? All right, so you're completely connected. And even if they're not surveilling that all the time, we become so dependent on these apps. Like we can never detach ourselves from the technology even for an instant. And then, of course, all the video and facial recognition that goes on in public spaces these days. They're very, very good now at identifying. The FBI in the United States, and not just the FBI, I'm sure, have got a system in place where they want to create an entire population profile based on facial recognition. And to my understanding, they've got like almost half the US population in that database. It's huge. And it's actually not that difficult because everyone's eyes and nose are at a slightly different, unique angle, right? It's like a unique triangle for your face, and that's one way they get you. And there's other ways, obviously, that they'll be able to identify your face in a database wherever you go. So go to a protest sometime. You'll go in the database. Global audio voice tracking. So wherever you go in the world, I mentioned this just earlier, your voice has a distinctive, unique audio signal, I guess I could say. So if you make a phone call from anywhere, increasingly, it will be possible to just track you all the time. It's a 24/7 surveillance. And what does that mean when you're surveilled 24/7? You're intimidated 24/7. If you know you're being monitored, you're going to act very differently. Don't you remember the statements that some people will often put out there? Well, there's nothing to be afraid of if you have nothing to hide. And you hear this, and people who say this really have no understanding of the world. They really have none. To be able to say that, it's a naivete beyond anything I can imagine. Because throughout human history, it's not just a recent phenomenon. Governments have always taken advantage of power to use it against all kinds of people, often without justice. So governments don't act justly. In fact, that's the exception rather than the rule when they act in a just fashion. Governments always want to use power to increase their power. Ultimately, the plan is microchips, and actually I don't even think that's accurate anymore. I think probably we're racing past that technology, and something better than microchips will be on the way. Whatever that is, we can't even imagine this stuff. Another method of control, fear. And this has happened because you have a major media that is fully integrated now with the national security state, the national security establishment. They're in bed with each other. They have been for ages, probably for really the lifetime of everyone sitting in this room, which creates official narratives. I talked about this in my false flag lecture to some extent, through censorship, spin, false news, false flags. I was talking with someone a week ago or so, and they mentioned the Belgian terrorist attack from 2016, if you remember that. You may recall also that CNN and BBC and other agencies put out fake video imagery of those events. They took imagery from Russia from 5 years earlier, one in Minsk and one at the Moscow airport, portraying them as the Belgian attacks. Why would they do that? Like, really, why would they do that? This is confirmable. You can search this one. It's very easy to see this one. It's not an accident, even though BBC and CNN both apologized and said, oh, in our haste to get the story out, we used the wrong footage. How do you do that? Like, really? From the same country from 5 years earlier, thinking you'll get away with it. Why would they? Amber Lyon, formerly of CNN, covered the Arab Spring. She's famously talked about how CNN created fake news on behalf of nations, U.S. and other nations, for purposes of spin, lies, and deception. You can look her up. The late Dr. Udo Ulfkotte of Germany, who died about 1.5 years ago, I believe, talked about how in Europe, many of the European journalists are literally explicitly on the CIA payroll and told what stories to publish that the CIA wrote for them. And this is what Ulfkotte said happened to him. He had a couple of stories on Libya, he said, that were put out under his name that were written by CIA. And if he had refused, he would have been out of work. Toward the end of his career and the end of his life, he came clean and talked about this, and you can listen to his interviews. So this is a major thing that's out there, and this is the continuation of Operation Mockingbird, which I talked about earlier. Control of censorship, control of spin and news and so forth, and a lot of it to create fear in people, to create insecurity and create dependency. It's an old story. It's not a new thing. Another way to control this is by poisoning us through bad food, through bad pharmaceutical drugs, which are shoved into the mouths of minors and young people around the world. And look, if you're a parent and this happened to your child, I'm not criticizing you. I understand. I have 2 children that I raise. I know how difficult it is to fight that system, and every parent's trying to just do their best. It's not easy. But the fact is, there's a system in place right now to grab your child and to drug them. It's super profitable for those interests involved, but also it's just really good to dull the mind of more and more people for whom there is no future. If there's nothing for you, it's better just to have you, veg out on virtual reality video games, bad food, poisoning your body, poisoning your mind, so you're not able to deal with the system as it is. You just tune out. Yeah. The illegal drug trade. Oh, electronic frequencies. I was just chatting with an Aussie just a couple of weeks ago. He's really quite an expert on this and opened my mind to a lot of what's going on in EMF dangers, which are damaging to us, mitochondria, DNA, and much more. The illegal narcotics, that's not an accident. CIA has overseen drug trade for many, many years, not just the CIA. It's out there. In fact, one of my early conversations with Catherine about drugs, this is over a decade ago, I'm on the phone with her, Catherine Austin Fitz. I was in one of my rants, which, as you can probably tell, is not an unusual thing, and I was talking with her about drugs, and I just said something like, damn it, just legalize all the drugs, for God's sake, stop criminalizing this. And she said, well, that's great, Richard, you just see a banking failure in the immediate aftermath of that. And I said, oh, how's that? And she argued that drug trafficking is one of the important greases to the system to get everything moving. There's a tremendous amount of profit in drug trafficking, and it filters through the major banks. They get a lot of their money that way, financing fees and so forth. It's great for them to have drugs as illegal. So anyway, it's also good for elites who want to have a stupefied population. I mean, it's obviously that you can see the utility in that. And then all the chemicals we're ingesting. So we're, yes, poisoning our bodies is a method of control. Erasing our identities is another method of control. I'm definitely not a fan of identity politics and political correctness. I talk about that once in a while. There's a lot of people talking about that much more effectively than I do. But the reason I don't like it, the reason I think it's dangerous, and the reason I think you should run away from that ideology is that it's an intellectual poison. And the reason it's a poison is because it's actually an attack on the true source of ideological freedom in this world, which is what we might call classical liberalism. What is classical liberalism? It's a simple idea. Simple idea. It's that you are responsible for your actions. You are not responsible for the actions of your ethnic group. You are not responsible for the actions of your grandparents or your great-grandparents. That's ridiculous. You are responsible for yourself. And in classical liberal ideology, every person is to be judged on the basis of their actions. Not even their thoughts, by the way. Their actions, what they do. And to me, that's the foundation of what a free society should be about, and it's the foundation of what a healthy society should be about. And so what we are seeing, however, is an erasure of that foundation, which is part of the thing that has made our civilization so incredible over the past several centuries. And there's a direct attack on it. So I think it's dangerous, and it poses, as I say here, trivial cultural issues like, bathrooms, as major crises, while meanwhile an entire world is being torn to pieces. So that's a problem. Schools don't help, and Google and Facebook don't help either. We're now at the point where your search results are explicitly being managed by Google and Facebook. In fact, they're telling you, they're very, very explicit about this now, that they will derank. It's almost like every week something new is coming out where Google or Facebook will state that they will derank listings based on how dangerous they are and how hateful they are. Facebook just announced a collaboration with the Atlantic Alliance. Look them up. They are neocon empire builders, big time, and they are now working with Facebook to monitor the legitimacy of news that appears on Facebook feeds. Yeah, bad idea. Bad idea. So it's an erasure of our very identities. And by the way, I'll just point out the war on fake news, which is really the latest iteration of this. So where fake news today is where hate speech was about 10 years ago. And what I mean by that is, hate speech 10 years ago was sort of like the leading edge of where governments said, we have the right to regulate your speech because we think such and such type of speech is hateful and divisive, and therefore we have the right to censor you and even imprison you based on what you say because we say it's hateful. Okay, well, that's a very dangerous idea. Clearly, I hope you agree. But now what I think is that fake news is now becoming the new hate speech in the sense that like the nation of Malaysia, just a month ago or so, announced laws explicitly against fake news to protect the public from news that's fake. And if you were guilty of disseminating fake news, you can go to jail in Malaysia or pay a hefty fine, or maybe both. And it's not just Malaysia. UK has basically lost their minds over the whole Russia thing and Skripal case. And I mean, my God, they've lost it. And so they now they're moving toward legislation against fake news. You watch. And the EU in general is going to do this. The United States is so far, as bad as it's gotten in the US, we still have a constitutional amendment, thank goodness, that guarantees the right to freedom of speech. Now, there are people in the US who want to throw out that Constitution, and maybe they'll have their way one day, but right now that Constitution is still in effect, and so it's embedded. It's a little bit tougher in the US to go that route. It's one of the nicer things in the US. We have our own problems. But this is what we're looking toward. It's a control and a transformation of our identity. And then you've got, allow me please to go down this road a little bit with you. I think we can do this. A debasing of our soul. This is what our modern culture is doing. And it's not that we don't want freedom of expression, but there's something insidious happening to our world where this type of imagery becomes part of our popular culture. And it's not just Gaga, it's everywhere. I mean, the music industry is probably most replete with this type of debasement, but you see it everywhere in a sexualized, trivial, and fantasy-based environment that's all around us now. Everything's fantasy. The movies are all about fantasy. Nothing really gets you into the reality anymore. Not in our popular culture. And particularly with gaming and virtual reality, which is, I mean, I'm terrified to think of what next generation virtual reality gaming is going to be like. Particularly 5G. It's probably going to fry your eyeballs as well as your brain. And a total entrainment and entrancement, probably, of the human mind. Guaranteed. So, in other words, and why is that important? Why does it matter that our souls are poisoned? Well, this is why. And I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So I'll come to that. So it's about the transformation of our culture to create a docile population, to create a confused population. And yes, weaponizing people is important too. When you're that easily manipulated, you can be worked up as needed toward whatever specific new enemy is necessary. This is just right out of Orwell's 1984. Now it's against racists or against sexists or against Trump or against Putin. Take your pick. And it's not that any of these things are good things. Obviously, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that certain concepts and categories are being used against you specifically for purposes of manipulation. That's what I'm saying. This is the purpose, to eliminate certain ideas of freedom, particularly economic freedom, also political freedom, desire for privacy. And again, you see this in the new generation, younger people. This is why I think poisoning of our souls is dangerous. I created this little graphic. It's not the best graphic, but it gives you an idea. You can see human beings having basic needs and as having higher needs. So basic needs would include like food and career and friends and love and sex, family, money. You can probably come up with other things too. I have love on both of these. I think love is a basic need, and I think love is a higher need. But there's other higher needs too. Ideas and creativity, spirituality, understanding. These are higher needs. These are the things really that make human civilization truly wonderful and transcendent. I think you will all agree. And what is it? We have a mass culture that basically blots out the one. This is my little graphic. It blots this out and highlights the basic needs. And what that means is we're more easily manipulated. Here's Katy Perry at the Super Bowl and, the football games and Jersey Shore and whatever else. It's to drag you down into the lowest of the needs and eliminating the higher needs. It's basically...
Does it help us feel safer and more at peace, or does it create more fear and uncertainty?
Okay, that's a great question. Why talk about these things? Does it make us feel safer, or does it create fear? I think this is a perfect final question to ask, and I'm glad that you asked it. Everyone is different, you know? We're all different. And everyone's got a different level of what they're comfortable with in their world. This is true. So I ask myself, I often think of it as like having a dream. So let's say I'm in my house, and I'm dreaming of being on a beach, drinking a martini, maybe getting a foot massage. But meanwhile, my house is on fire. So the question is, do I want to wake up? And I think the answer is I would. I would want to wake up. I do not believe in fear-mongering. It's the last thing I want to do. In my own personal life, the truth is I'm generally a happy person. That's the truth. I think about things that are heavy and difficult. That is so. But I believe, you know, there's an old saying, the best revenge is living well. And the best thing that we can do, whether we're dealing with an oppressive system or a utopia, is we have to work on ourselves. That's the ultimate battle, is making ourselves individuals that we can respect at the end of the day. That's what it's all about. And for me, the only way that I can achieve that is by doing what I believe I'm meant to do, which is to research this and to work my way through this labyrinth. And to anyone who wants to come along for the ride. That's essentially it. But, you know, the other thing is that human beings throughout all of our history have lived through horrible, horrible injustice. I mean, horrible things. And we shield ourselves from that history all the time. But in fact, it's the norm. It's not the exception. So life is a difficult proposition. And at the end of it, we all check out. Everyone checks in and everyone checks out at the end. So along that way, in that blink of an eye, that snap of a finger, which is human life, whether it's 10 years or 20 years or 80 years, it's fast. So we have this much time to make it authentic and to live the way that our highest selves can be proud of. And that's what it's all about. And within that confrontation of dangerous, difficult things, we find strength in ourselves that we never knew existed. I guarantee you that is true. By confronting that, by looking at it with a cold eye, you see and you find that strength and power inside you, and you become much greater than you ever would be otherwise. That's it.